people think they're better than black people, and they want to oppress us, and they want us to allow ourselves to be oppressed.
This is the big, I agree with you perfectly. This is the basic problem.
Then what do you
that white people think they're better than others?
I can't solve the problem. You guys pull the strings that close schools. You guys draw the boundaries that keep our kids restricted to the ghetto. You guys write up the restrictive covenants that keep us out of houses. So it's up to you to talk to your brothers and your sisters and persuade them that they have a responsibility. We've assumed ours for over 400 years, and we're tired of this kind of stuff now. We're not going to suffer patiently anymore. No more turning the other cheek. No more blessing our enemies. No more praying for those who despitefully use us. We're going to show you that we've learned the lessons you've taught us. We've studied your history, and you did not take over this country by singing "We Shall Overcome." You did not gain control of the world like you have it now by dealing fairly with a man and keeping your word. You're treaty breakers, you're liars, you're thieves, you rape entire continents and races of people. Then you wonder why these very people don't have any confidence or trust in you. Your religion means nothing. Your law is a farce, and we see it every day. You demonstrated it in Alabama. And I can say you because you're part of the whole system. You profit from it. In fact, you make your living from it. You couldn't walk around and talk to people, stand up in your pulpit on Sunday and preach nice little songs and say, now we're going to give thanks to the Lord for he is good and oh Jesus be among us. As far as we're concerned, your Jesus is contaminated, just like everything else you tried to force upon us is contaminated.
Peace, fam. Am I realizing something very important, something that I kind of always knew, but I kept it on the back burner because I didn't want to distract away from my primary studies at present. I realized that no matter how healthy you are, if you don't know history and who you are, you're liable to say stupid things. And you're liable to say these stupid things at any point in time, even in front of national television. Healing is holistic, so the approach must deal with the whole being, the body, the mind, and the spirit. And as much as people don't like to hear it, study is a crucial segment of healing the mind, not only of your craft, but of history. And if you don't study, you can end up being a very healthy, herb-taking puppet for someone who does know your history better than you. So I'm going to present a small narrative against the general narrative of Aboriginal people and show you why one of the things that most people suffer from is the inability to self-define, meaning recognize what they see as what it is and not what social puppeteers have told them it is. If an oppressor tells you that war is only guns and soldiers, then you won't recognize when psychological warfare is being waged against you, the build-up to the physical warfare. If they tell you an overthrow is only done with guns and bloodshed, then you won't recognize an overthrow done with persistence and attacks from the political, opportunistic, and rebellious fronts, the three different fronts, three out of many different fronts that a battle can be fought on. Aboriginal men must read their history so that they don't live in fear and confusion and be easily manipulated, as what you can very plainly see is happening. It's just as important as any herb or exercise regimen that you could take. Now, what I'm going to show you illustrates two things. One, why you should study diligently. One, why study of history is just as medicinal to any herb or as any herb or any type of health regimen. Excuse me. We're going to talk here or read here a little bit on the slave rebellion. I'm going to skip this part and just read this little part for you. All right. Ancient Sparta had a special type of serf called helots, who were often treated harshly, leading them to rebel. According to Herodotus, helots were 7 times as numerous as Spartans. Every autumn, according to Plutarch, the Spartan ephors would pro forma declare war on the helot population, so that any Spartan citizen could kill a helot without fear of blood or guilt in order to keep them in line. Now they have in here parentheses Cryptia. Let's see who the Cryptia are. The Cryptia meaning hidden secret things, was an ancient Spartan state institution involving young Spartan men. Its goal and nature are still a matter of discussion and debate among historians, but some scholars consider the Cryptia to be a kind of secret police and state security force organized by the ruling classes of Sparta, whose purpose was to terrorize the servile Helot population. Others believe it to be a form of military training, similar to Athenian ephebia. So, when they slip this word Cryptia in here, then they link the Spartan citizens who were involved in this pro forma declaration to kill the Helots as part of the Cryptia, as part of the secret police. Now, who were the Helots? The Helots were a subjugated population group that formed the main population of Laconia and Messenia, the territory controlled by Sparta. Their exact status was already disputed in antiquity. So now, who today has a status that is disputed in antiquity? Who are the people here in the Americas who have a particular history that is really spread out, so much so that they are referred to as the diaspora, that have a history that's unknown or known but not an official status recognized in the Americas? Who does that sound like? So it says their exact status was already disputed in antiquity. According to Critias, they were slaves to the utmost. Interesting. Whereas according to Pollux, they occupied a status between freemen and slaves. So this is a matter of relative outlook. One called them slaves, one said they were freemen and slaves. The status, or that range, but it doesn't matter because they were not citizens and they were not allowed to engage in the privileges and immunities of the citizens of that time. So they were still subjugated, regardless of how you looked at it, be they free or be they slaves, or somewhere between. Tied to the land, they primarily worked in agriculture as a majority and economically supported the Spartan citizens. So this slave labor economically supported Sparta, or the Spartan citizens, because they may not have necessarily been in Sparta, but Sparta, as it says, controlled this particular territory. So who does this sound like? These people who the secret police were able to kill at will from the orders of the upper class, who does that sound like? Does this sound like what's happening today? And if this sounds like what's happening today, do you think that it would not give you some sort of indication as to who your enemy is and who your friends are? Who are considered like you and who are not? How could this information not empower you even in the proper navigation of your daily living? This is what we're talking about here. Now, coming back to this, they speak of numerous slave states in the Roman Empire, in Europe, and in other places, Russia, etc. Here they go down to North America. Okay. So you know here from this particular narrative that slavery was almost global, right? In Russia, the slaves are classified as kolobs. A kolob's master had unlimited power over his life. Slavery remained a major institution in Russia until 1723, when Peter the Great converted the household slaves into house serfs. Okay, so it just basically made a transformation. Let's go down here to just the North American segment of slavery. Numerous African slave rebellions and insurrections took place in North America during the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. That's 300 years, I believe. There is a documented evidence of more than 250 uprisings or attempted uprisings involving 10 or more slaves. Three of the best known in the United States during the 19th century are the revolts by Gabriel Prosser in Richmond, Virginia in 1800, Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, Nat Turner in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. Slave resistance in the antebellum South did not gain the attention of academic historians until the 1940s, when historian Herbert Aptheker started publishing the first serious scholarly work on the subject. Aptheker stressed how rebellions were rooted in the exploitative conditions of the Southern slave system. He traversed libraries and archives throughout the South, managing to uncover roughly 250 similar instances. So these are just the recorded instances of rebellion. As we know, in this historical context, there were probably many, many more. I want to go here to something called the Colfax Massacre. And I'll explain why I'm reading this after we go through it a little bit. The Colfax Massacre, or Colfax Riot, which is what it should not have been called. The Colfax Massacre, as the events are termed on the 1950 state historic marker, occurred on Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, the seat of Grant Parish, when approximately 150 black men were murdered by white Southerners. The bloodiest single instance of racial carnage in the Reconstruction era, the Colfax Massacre was an example of the lengths to which some opponents of Reconstruction will go to regain their accustomed authority. These opponents of Reconstruction did not want any advancements on behalf of quote-unquote black people, just to make it simple. So this is what they're talking about when these people would go to any means to stop black expansion, black freedom. Among blacks, the incident was long remembered as proof that in any large confrontation, they stood at a fatal disadvantage. In the wake of the contested 1872 election for governor of Louisiana and local offices, a group of white Democrats, armed with rifles and a small cannon, overpowered Republican freedmen, and state militia, also black, meaning the militia was also black, a black militia. And a black militia just means, at that point in time, a black man who could own a gun. Okay, they were enrolled in a recorded militia, but it was just basically black men who owned guns. And let me show you that. Because, well, going back to this, let's go back to this first. Okay, so overpowered Republican freedmen and state militia, also black, occupying the Grant Parish courthouse in Colfax. Most of the freedmen were killed after they surrendered. Nearly 50 were killed later that night after being held as prisoners for several hours. And the reason they were killed, with all due respect to them, no disparage to them, they didn't know the treacherous people they were dealing with, which is what's happening today, which is why so many ignorant people are saying the things that they're saying and doing the things that they're doing, and not understanding who the hell they're dealing with. But anyway, most of the freedmen were killed after they surrendered. Nearly 50 were killed later that night after being held as prisoners for several hours. Estimates of the number of dead varied, ranging from 62 to 153. Three whites died, but the number of black victims was difficult to determine because bodies had been thrown into the river or removed for burial. There were rumors of mass graves at the site. And again, I'll show you why I'm bringing this up. Now, when I said that state militia just means a black militia just means a black man with a gun? Because this is 1873. Black men could not own guns. 1875, United States. High Court's rule has no power to stop KKK members from disarming blacks. Now, this was the result of a case where KKK members were killing black people who were trying to invoke their right to gun ownership, the Second Amendment. Right here, Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified, reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What black people didn't know at that point in time is they were not considered people. Okay, but that's another story. Let's go back down here. So black people were trying to adopt the right to gun ownership, but the KKK, which was basically another secret police organization, state established institution that were disarming black people. They could not have gained so much power without being a part of the state. Let's get that clear. In the United States versus Cruikshank, a member of the KKK, Cruikshank had been charged with violating the rights of two black men to peaceably assemble and to bear arms. The United States Supreme Court held that the federal government had no power to protect citizens against private actions not committed by federal or state government authorities. So this is what I mean by secret police. The KKK is not considered an official police force, and at that time they were considered basically private citizens. They were not connected to the federal or state government. Therefore, the federal government had no right to stop them from disarming non-citizens. That's not what they said, but that is obviously what the case was, because blacks were considered non-citizens. And the federal establishment, the federal government, would not override a citizen's privilege to assert some type of authority over a non-citizen. We have to understand that is what the essence of what this was. Okay, so the U.S. Supreme Court held that the federal government had no power to protect citizens against private action not committed by federal or state government authorities. Okay, that's private actions that deprive them of their constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment. The court held that for protection against private criminal action, individuals are required to look to state government. So that what they were saying was they couldn't go to the federal government. The black people had to go to the state government. The doctrine in Cruikshank that blacks would have to look to state government for protection against criminal conspiracies gave the green light to private forces like the KKK, like the White League, to often with the assistance of state and local governments that sought to subjugate former slaves, and with the protective arm of the federal government withdrawn because the federal government turned their backs on them, protection of black lives and property was left largely to hostile state governments. Okay, so when you take in consideration this, you go back to the Colfax Massacre, you see that these state militiamen were basically men who were allowed to have guns. Now, these 150 men, which I'm pretty sure was more, were a mix of freedmen and militiamen. So some of them had guns, some of them didn't. Okay, and a few men with guns, I propose, and some men with no guns were up against a group of white Democrats armed with rifles and a small cannon. Now, another reason I bring this up is because this is an example that black men did not simply accept slavery. Now, slavery did end 10 years or 8 years prior, officially, and I won't even say, if you understand the history, you know that it didn't necessarily end. There was just a proclamation allowing a very broad amount of privileges and the ability of black people to not have to be in servitude in certain parts of the United States. Okay? But aside from all that, I bring this up because there were men who were adamantly not making the choice to abide by slavery, not making the choice to be put back into slavery. They were giving their lives against insurmountable odds. So again, I'm going to attack the ridiculous point that black people accepted slavery as a choice. So let me show you why the proclamation did not necessarily end slavery, okay? Far from it. And this is why I don't understand why a lot of people are ignorant of history, because it's right here. As you can see, I've been basically staying within the realm of Wikipedia. I mean, there's a lot of information outside of them, but the information is here for people to know what the hell's going on. And so the level of ignorance that I'm hearing is just forcing me to just basically speak out against a lot of what's going on. So we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, let's see what it is, or what it was. The Emancipation Proclamation or Proclamation 95 was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. It changed the federal legal status of more than 3 million enslaved African Americans in the designated areas of the South from slave to free. As soon as a slave escaped the control of the Confederate government by running away or through advances of federal troops, the slave became legally free. Ultimately, the rebel surrendered, liberated, and resulted in the proclamation's application to all of the designated slaves. It did not cover slaves in Union areas that were freed by state action or by the Constitution, the 13th Constitution, 3 years later. So the slaves who were in Union states were not freed until the 13th Amendment was passed. Okay, so that is an obvious example of the proclamation not freeing all of the slaves. It was issued as a war measure during the American Civil War, directed to all of the areas in rebellion and all segments of the executive branch, including the Army and Navy of the United States. Now, let's start to skip over some things that are basically not important to or not germane to our main point. Because it was issued under the president's authority to suppress rebellion, it necessarily excluded areas not in rebellion. So what people have to understand is there were basically two countries fighting. America was two countries, the Confederate country, the Union States, or the Confederate States and the Union States. The Confederate States, the Southern States basically said, we are our own country. The Union said, no, we are all of the United States. You cannot succeed. To hell with you. That's not happening. The Confederate States said, kiss my ass, we doing it. So those two countries mustered their own armies, because you got to remember, even though the Confederacy wasn't recognized as a country, it had its own army, militia, economy, etc. It had everything a country has, including proclamations of it being a country, and a separate Senate, a separate Congress, a separate capital. So what happened was, there were Union states though that allowed slavery, and there were also territories that did not rebel against the Union orders. They were neutral. So these neutral areas who said, listen, we're not going to contest your authority. We're just going to mind our business. Well, the proclamation didn't apply to them, because what Lincoln wanted to do was he wanted to tell the slaves who were subordinated, hey, we can give you freedom if you help us fight against the Confederacy. The slaves, or the territories that the Union already controlled, they weren't really concerned with slavery. Okay, it was a war measure. And as it says here, The proclamation did not compensate owners, did not outlaw slavery, and did not grant citizenship to the ex-slaves, called freedmen. Remember what we discussed earlier, it's the freedmen. And when we discussed the Spartan state-sanctioned killing of the non-citizens. It made the eradication of slavery an explicit war goal. It made the eradication of slavery an explicit war goal. Lincoln was just playing the right cards to have the Union States own the Union State territories and the Confederacy territories, what was known as the Confederacy territories. Okay, so this is what we mean when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation being far from necessarily an outlawing of slavery in general. It was a goal, and it was directed towards several states and several institutions. But it lasted in many places, even in some Union states, long after 1865. Let's just get that straight. So now another means, and one of the most important means by which black people fought their way out of slavery, mostly black men, which again shows the fact that they never resigned to slavery, but fought to get into the very high places, the very essential places where they could dismantle slavery through the legislature, was to vote and participate in holding a legislative office. So we'll find here that they did this so much that they formed basically military components of the state to take over the offices that they held and to push them out through military force. The White League, also known as the White Man's League, was an American white paramilitary organization started in 1874 to kick Republicans out of office and intimidate freedmen from voting and politically organize. Affiliated with the Democratic Party, now see, just a cursory overview of history will show you that the Democratic Party started from an organization, or from various organizations that were wholeheartedly against the interests of the Aboriginal people, so-called slaves or African Americans or blacks. Anyway, affiliated with the Democratic Party, its first chapter was formed in Grant Parish, Louisiana, and neighboring parishes, made up of many of the Confederate veterans who had participated in the Colfax Massacre in April 1873. Chapters were soon founded in New Orleans and other areas of the state. So these paramilitary groups formed in various areas of the state, and also in other states, I would say. The Red Shirts was a similar group that formed chapters in Mississippi and the Carolinas. Okay, so this was statewide militias basically being formed against the advancement of black people who were holding offices in legislature, to kick them out, to basically take over a state. Active during the later years of the Reconstruction, these paramilitary groups were described as the military arm of the Democratic Party. Through violence and intimidation of blacks and allied whites, their members suppressed Republican voting and contributed to the Democrats taking control of the Louisiana legislature in 1876 and to Democratic control in the other southern states. So you got to remember, well, we'll read further on and I'll explain the Republican-Democratic thing a little bit more. After white Democrats regained control of the state legislature in 1876, members of the White Leagues were absorbed into the state militias and the National Guard. Very, very interesting. Although sometimes linked with secret vigilante groups, the KKK and Knights of the White Camellia, the White League and other paramilitary groups of the later 1870s marked a significant change. Okay, so they marked a significant change. All of these groups formed throughout these states They operated openly in community, solicited coverage from newspapers, and the men's identities were generally known. Similar paramilitary groups were chapters of the Red Shirts, started in the Mississippi in 1875, and active also in North and South Carolina. They had explicit political goals to overthrow the Reconstruction government. The Reconstruction government was the government that was by Aboriginal or black people. This is the government that they overthrew. They directed their activities towards intimidation and removal of Northern and African American Republican candidates and office holders. This is where they dismantled budding black governments. These black governments were formed because these ex-slaves, these freedmen, and these articulated black men were forming governments to overthrow slavery in all the states, because only by legislation can you officially overthrow and make a people abide by a policy. And they were educated enough to hold these offices. This is what people have to understand. How in the hell can it be claimed that black people did not fight their way out of slavery? And this is just one arm. Well, again, they had to embrace two arms, the military arm and the legislative arm, because when they held the legislative offices, they were met with these military organizations that sought to overthrow them. So they directed their activities towards intimidation and removal of Northern and African American Republican candidates and office holders. See, the Republican office started off as a branch supportive of the black man. Made up of well-armed Confederate veterans, they worked to turn Republicans out of office, disrupt their political organizing, and use force to intimidate and terrorize freedmen to keep them from the polls. Backers helped finance purchases of up-to-date arms, and then they cover all of the arms that they bought. Some sources charge the White League with culpability for the Colfax massacre. Okay, so this is connecting these two, connecting these militias and this massacre of 1973 or 1873, right? Christopher Columbus Nash, a Confederate veteran, former prisoner of war at Johnston's Island in Ohio, and the former sheriff of Grant Parish led companies of white militias at Colfax to turn out Republican office holders and African Americans defending the courthouse. Defending the courthouse. That don't sound like laying down to slavery to me. In 1874, White League members murdered Julia Hayden, a 17-year-old African-American girl who was working as a school teacher in Hatfield, Tennessee. And there were also other issues or other events. The Colchester Massacre, all right, where the local White League forced 6 Republican office holders to resign and promised to leave the state. The League assassinated the men before they left the parish. Right? Together with between 5 and 20 freedmen who were witnesses. In a battle of Liberty Place in September 14, 1874, 5,000 members of the White League routed 3,500 police and state militia to turn out the Republican governor. How were these members, this supposedly rogue group, able to rout 300 or 3,500 police and state militia to turn out the... So this is the government, basically, the state government, overthrowing a budding black government, which we could also say was a standing government. So we're talking about black men who fought, and again, using the Lincoln opportunity to fight against the Confederacy. I could show you information where black people knew that it wasn't necessarily because they were needed for the purposes of their helping their brother. They knew it was a war tactic, but they knew it was a tactic they could also use for their advantage to free themselves of the Confederacy and start to form these legislative governments. So knowing history is medicine for the mind, because you will know why the things are happening today, why they're occurring, and from there you can map how things will proceed in the future, or how you can manipulate things yourself for your future. You can see the game being played out, and if you don't know this, you can be in perfect health, as I stated before, but surround yourself with people who are vampires, people who will feed off you and turn you from a so-called musical genius to a rambling, medicated lunatic who will let anything fall out your mouth. You'll ally yourself with the people who will watch you self-destruct and end up half dead in a brothel somewhere, or steal all the intellectual property of your creativity and leave you broke and destitute when they make money off your music, or your acting, your films, or your inventions for decades. Why? Because you didn't see the game being played on you that has been repeatedly played and historically played in one form or another on your ancestors. I believe the Bible does say, "My people perish for lack of knowledge." So we must study. We must study. Study is medicine for the mind, just as critical as herbs, proper eating for your body type, staying active, etc. It is holistic. This is why psychologists like Amos Wilson, peace be upon her, Frances Cress Welsing, peace be upon her, they knew history. This is why Dr. Layla Africa knows history, why Dr. Tim Morrow knows history, Dr. Phil Valentine. These people are all very versed in history, not only the history of their profession, but the history of the environment, the country that they were in or that they are in, as well as their historical experience. This is why you must know history, because as I said, you can be in a perfect physical health and not know the preventative medicinal art of your historical past, thus your present status. You have to know this because entities with sway over your reality can affect you. If you don't know this, you'll wander into a situation where your enemies are all around you. Your enemy is feeding you. Your enemy is clothing you, teaching your children. Okay? And we all see how that makes a people end up. So I think the picture should be pretty clear. Peace.
Come on. Feel it. Let's go. Like a needle on a record or a needle to the skin. Something else pumps out when it pumps in. It could be blood or feel the sound system with the fly melody, lyrics and rhythm. It's another one. 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 It's
I know
another
it when I
one.
feel it. I feel it in my spirit. Makes me wanna cry. Take me to a place and time when I learn how to live this life. For the beautiful ride it is. The day I made the vow to be his. Sounds feeling like prisms of light. From the beaming face of the sun. Waiting for the morning to come. It's another one.
Coca-Colas and anything else. But none of them put any money back in the black community. Because under the doctrine of what they call unequal exchange, they're taking everything out and putting nothing back. And black folk haven't got the guts of the consumption to say, no, we will never again support anything, any business, any political parties, or anybody, regardless of your color. Even if you're black, if you don't support the black community, you can sing and dance all you want to if you want to be a member of even of the black overclass. We won't buy your music. We're not coming to your football, basketball games. We're not going to support anybody that won't support the black community. That's the way you start playing the game and winning. Because right now, black folk are being sucked alive in Africa. They're being sucked alive in America. That's why they own and control nothing. That's why you're totally insignificant. That's why you're irrelevant. That's why you're impoverished and poor and disorganized. That's why the black kids walk the streets saying Black Lives Matter. They matter to whom? You have no value. You don't own and control anything. All that you can do, if they kill 20 blacks a week, every week on the streets, all you're going to do is march and sing, "We shall overcome someday."